Welcome to the Hot News Channel, where we strip away the noise to analyze today's breaking stories. It is Saturday, February 28th, 2026.
And today's broadcast marks a pivotal moment in global history. And I genuinely mean that. That is not hyperbole. We are currently witnessing a simultaneous, unprecedented collapse of established norms across completely disconnected pillars of human civilization.
Right.
In one sphere, we are watching machine learning terraform the global economy almost overnight, rendering entire classes of knowledge work obsolete. In another, the United States military is teetering on the absolute razor's edge of a massive Middle Eastern conflict, driven by fiercely contested, contradictory intelligence.
And beneath all of that,
Exactly. Beneath all of this, we are observing shocking, tragic, systemic failures of basic bureaucracy right here at home. These are not isolated events. They are the fracture lines of a broader institutional fragility that is accelerating faster than our ability to track it.
our mission in this deep dive is to extract the hard data and the hidden truths from today's reports. You will hear explosive, politically charged allegations spanning from the highest offices in the country to international war zones. We are not here to endorse any political side, left or right. Our mandate is to impartially break down the documentation and the facts provided, empowering you to understand the realities hidden beneath the rhetoric. We follow the data, period.
The data right now is flashing red across the board, particularly when we look at the architecture of the modern workforce. Let's start with the job market, because the horizon of technological disruption didn't just arrive. It shattered the glass and let itself in.
Look at the staggering economic numbers reported by Tom Bilyeu. Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Block, the financial technology conglomerate formerly known as Square, just executed a massive workforce reduction.
A massive reduction.
He eliminated 4,400 people. If you look at Block's total headcount, that is roughly 40% to half of his entire staff, erased in a single stroke.
In one day.
Yes. But the raw number of layoffs isn't the story here. The story is the balance sheet. Block is already wildly profitable. As of this layoff, they are generating over $2 million in profit per employee.
I have to push back on Dorsey's explicit narrative here, though.
Go ahead.
Whenever we see a mass layoff of this magnitude, the immediate executive instinct is to blame macroeconomic headwinds or point to a technological revolution. We just came out of a multi-year period where the tech sector engaged in an absolute hiring binge. Companies hoarded talent just to prevent competitors from having it.
That's true, the pandemic hoarding.
Right. So isn't it highly probable that blaming advanced language models is just a very convenient, buzzword-friendly cover story for standard corporate right-sizing?
I hear that skepticism, and a year ago I would have completely agreed with you. But Dorsey brought the receipts to the earnings call. The documentation proves that Block had already executed their post-pandemic right-sizing back in 2024.
So they already trimmed the fat.
Exactly. They trimmed the fat 2 years ago. This specific reduction of 4,400 people was explicitly justified by the integration of automated intelligence into their core workflows. Dorsey stated plainly that advanced language models have simply become too effective, allowing radically smaller teams to accomplish vastly more output. He isn't trimming fat anymore. He is amputating limbs because the prosthetic is just faster.
If we accept that premise, the implications are absolutely staggering. Traditionally, a company generating $2 million in profit per employee would be expanding its footprint.
Building new campuses.
Aggressively recruiting. By choosing to have the workforce instead, Dorsey is sending a massive signal to every other board of directors on the planet. Human capital is no longer the primary engine of scale. And this aligns perfectly with the deeply alarming forecast released by Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei.
The 20% number.
Yes. He is currently projecting a 20% unemployment rate specifically within white-collar sectors over the next 12 to 18 months.
A 20% unemployment rate in the knowledge sector is difficult to even conceptualize.
Let's put some historical context around that number for you. A healthy, functioning economy typically hums along at roughly a 4% unemployment rate. When unemployment hits 10%, economists declare a severe recession bordering on a crisis.
Right.
A 20% unemployment rate doesn't just cause a recession, it plunges the economy into deep depression territory. And we must be meticulously clear about what white collar means in Amodei's forecast.
We are not talking about data entry clerks.
Not at all. We are talking about Paralegals compiling case law, financial advisors modeling portfolios, mid-level software engineers writing back-end code, and logistics coordinators. These are the demographics that spent decades accumulating massive student debt under the fundamental assumption that their specialized cognitive skills insulated them from automation.
Well, the insulation is completely gone. Take the data point regarding perplexity that surfaced in the financial reports this week. An automated $200 a month subscription service is now mathematically capable of performing 80% of the core analytical functions of Bloomberg's financial terminal empire.
The Bloomberg terminal.
For decades, the Bloomberg terminal has been the ultimate, impenetrable moat in global finance. It costs tens of thousands of dollars a year per single user.
And every serious trading desk has to have one.
Exactly. It provides proprietary data feeds, instant analytics, and secure communication. And now, a consumer-grade advanced language model is evaporating an 80% chunk of that multi-billion-dollar moat in real time.
The destruction of that moat introduces a terrifying secondary effect, which is unprecedented security vulnerabilities.
Right.
If a $200 tool can parse complex financial data better than a seasoned analyst, what happens when you point that exact same cognitive engine at a sovereign nation's digital infrastructure? We don't have to guess, because we saw it happen this week with the government of Mexico.
The reporting on the Mexican government hack reads like a cyberpunk novel, but it's completely real.
Entirely real.
The advanced language model known as Claude was weaponized to breach their secure networks. And the attacker didn't use sophisticated, custom-built malware. They simply jailbroke the system's ethical guardrails using conversational prompts.
That's the easy part.
By continuously reframing the context of their requests, the attacker forced the model to generate thousands of ready-to-execute attack scripts and methodically map out internal government targets.
The methodology is what we need to focus on here. The attacker didn't need a doctorate in cryptography or years of experience finding zero-day exploits. They used semantic manipulation.
Right, they just talked it into doing the work.
Exactly. When the Claude system's safety protocols finally triggered and refused to write a specific piece of malicious code, the attacker didn't write it themselves. They simply pivoted to an entirely different consumer subscription model, fed it the parameters, and asked for guidance on how to move through the Mexican government system undetected.
2 consumer subscriptions.
2 subscriptions. That was the entirety of the toolkit required to compromise a nation-state.
This extreme democratization of destructive capability is exactly why we are seeing unprecedented pushback from the creators of these systems. Dario Amodei, the same CEO who predicted the 20% unemployment rate, was just reported to have flatly refused intense pressure from the Department of War.
That's a huge development.
The Pentagon wanted to utilize Anthropic's proprietary architecture for mass domestic surveillance on Americans and potentially integrate it into autonomous weapons platforms. Amodei said no.
Amodei's refusal is a fascinating historical anomaly.
Truly.
Normally, when the military-industrial complex comes to a tech founder offering billions of dollars in defense contracts, the founder takes the money. The fact that he is drawing a hard ethical line suggests that the developers of these models are genuinely terrified of what they have built. They understand that deploying this architecture for kinetic warfare or mass surveillance isn't just a slippery slope, it's a cliff.
It is a profound transitional phase, and we are seeing the friction of this transition everywhere, sometimes in bizarrely humorous ways. Just this week, the Pope was forced to issue a formal directive to Catholic priests globally, asking them to immediately stop using automated text generators to write their Sunday sermons.
The reason why is the most revealing part of that story.
Exactly. The priests weren't just reading the generated text. They were reading the structural punctuation out loud to their congregations.
That's incredible.
Because they didn't fully understand the formatting of the output they were generating, you had priests standing at the pulpit delivering a spiritual homily and literally saying the words M- mid-sentence.
It is a perfect microencapsulation of where human civilization is right now. We possess technology capable of dismantling the Mexican government's firewalls, yet the human operators at the terminal end are literally reading punctuation marks out loud because they don't understand the machinery they are wielding.
It's absurd.
But that awkward transitional phase is going to be incredibly brief. Let's look at the long-term timeline presented in the industry reporting, because the sequencing of this disruption upends decades of economic theory.
The projections laid out in the current reporting are aggressive. They forecast ubiquitous, fully autonomous, self-driving vehicles dominating the roads by 2029. By 2030, Automated medical systems are projected to consistently and reliably beat human doctors in complex diagnostic accuracy.
Diagnostic accuracy.
And by 2032, tremorless robotic surgery, guided entirely by advanced models, will become the baseline standard of care, replacing human surgeons in the operating room.
5 years ago, the consensus among labor economists was that blue-collar, physical labor would be the first casualty of automation. The assumption was that truck drivers, warehouse workers, and construction crews would be replaced by robots, while the creative and analytical white-collar class would remain untouched.
They had it completely backwards.
The data proves the exact opposite is happening. It turns out that disembodied intelligence is infinitely easier to scale than physical robotics. It is mathematically simpler to train a massive cluster of servers to pass the medical boards or write complex back-end software architecture than it is to engineer a bipedal robot that can successfully navigate the unpredictable, messy physical environment of crawling under a residential house to fix a plumbing leak.
The cognitive layer is being replaced before the physical layer. We are witnessing an invisible, silent terraforming of the domestic economy. But while the American workforce is quietly shifting beneath our feet, the geopolitical reality overseas is preparing for something deafeningly loud. Let's look at the massive intelligence disconnect regarding the Middle East. On February 24th, President Donald Trump delivered his State of the Union address, which ran for an astounding 1 hour and 48 minutes.
A speech of that duration is historically exhaustive. But it wasn't the stamina of the address that alarmed international observers. It was a highly specific, geographically terrifying claim embedded in the foreign policy section.
Trump explicitly stated to the nation and the world that Iran has successfully developed ballistic missiles capable of threatening European capitals and forward-deployed American bases. More critically, he claimed that Tehran is actively working to finalize intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that will, and I'm quoting directly here, soon reach the United States of America.
The word soon is doing an immense amount of heavy lifting in that sentence, and this is where we have to critically evaluate the hard data versus the political rhetoric. If you are trying to understand the actual threat matrix, you have to look at the classified assessments that guide the Pentagon.
Extensive reporting by Reuters this week brought to light the Defense Intelligence Agency's 2025 Golden Dome assessment. For context, the DIA is the premier military intelligence organization of the United States. Their entire mandate is to map foreign military capabilities.
Right.
Golden Dome assessment states clearly, in black and white, that Iran currently possesses 0 deployed ICBMs.
0. Not a handful hidden in silos. 0.
Furthermore, the DIA modeled the timeline for when that capability might exist. They concluded that even if Iran aggressively accelerated their program tomorrow and received massive technical assistance from an external power like Russia or China, a viable fleet of up to 60 ICBMs wouldn't be operational until the year 2035 at the absolute earliest.
That is nearly a decade from now. It is the furthest thing from soon.
This massive chasm between the political rhetoric of an imminent ICBM threat and the DIA's timeline forces us to analyze the terrifying physical reality of what the United States military is actually doing on the ground right now.
You don't build a military posture based on a threat that is 10 years away. You build it based on what you intend to do next week. And according to the logistical analysis provided by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis and several other defense experts, the current deployment of U.S. combat power to the Middle East is unprecedented in modern times.
Let's break down exactly what has been moved into the theater, because the sheer tonnage of weaponry is staggering. The Pentagon has deployed both the Gerald R. Ford and the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Groups to the region.
People need to understand what a carrier strike group actually is.
A single carrier strike group is essentially a floating sovereign military base, complete with its own air wing, guided missile cruisers, destroyers, and attack submarines. Deploying 2 of them means the U.S. has concentrated a full third of its total global naval power in one specific choke point.
But the aircraft carriers aren't even the most alarming metric. The true indicator of intent is the support logistics. The reporting shows that the military has relocated 50% of its entire global refueling tanker fleet into the Middle East. Let's dissect why that matters.
They are vulnerable assets.
Extremely vulnerable. Tankers are essentially massive, slow-moving flying gas stations. They have 0 offensive capabilities. You do not move half of your global refueling capacity into a theater simply to send a diplomatic message. If you are staging those highly vulnerable assets within range of Iranian air defenses, it strongly indicates that you are preparing for sustained, continuous, deep penetration combat sorties that require mid-air refueling.
To support that, they've also moved 25% of the military's strategic lift capabilities, meaning the massive C-17 and C-5 cargo planes responsible for hauling heavy armor and munitions. They have deployed squadrons of F-22 Raptors, which are fifth-generation stealth air superiority fighters designed specifically to dismantle advanced anti-aircraft grids.
And perhaps most tellingly, they have physically pulled the hot anti-ballistic missile batteries out of South Korea to position them in Israel.
Pulling THAAD out of Korea is a massive geopolitical gamble. THAAD is the Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense System. It is the premier kinetic shield against incoming ballistic missiles.
Right, and by removing that shield from the Korean peninsula, where North Korea routinely tests missiles over the Sea of Japan to park it in the Middle East, the Pentagon is explicitly signaling that they believe the threat of a regional ballistic missile exchange involving Israel is absolutely imminent.
The debate raging within defense circles is whether this massive buildup is a maximum pressure tactic designed to force Iran into a new, heavily restrictive nuclear negotiation, or if the logistics dictate that we are literally days away from a kinetic preemptive war.
The danger of a maximum pressure tactic is the gravity of the assets involved. When you park a third of your naval power and half your jet fuel within a few hundred miles of a heavily armed adversary, the momentum of war often takes over, regardless of the initial political intent in Washington. A single miscalculation, a single rogue drone strike, and those assets are forced to engage.
And we have to examine the historical precedent here, because we literally just went through a version of this. Look at the events of June 2025 during Operation Midnight Hammer. The U.S. executed a massive, highly complex preemptive strike. 7 B-2 stealth bombers flew a continuous, long-haul mission from the continental United States to drop 14 30,000-pound bunker-buster bombs directly onto deep underground Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan.
A 30,000-pound bunker buster is designed to penetrate solid granite mountains before detonating. It is the heaviest conventional ordnance in the U.S. arsenal.
Following the B-2 strikes, U.S. submarines in the region launched a secondary barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles. In the immediate aftermath, the political apparatus claimed a total victory, stating that the Iranian nuclear program had been fundamentally obliterated and set back by decades.
But the hard intelligence data proved otherwise. Mere months after Operation Midnight Hammer, independent satellite imagery from Planet Labs showed completely new, reinforced roofs constructed over the damaged entry points at Fordow and Natanz. Classified intelligence assessments quickly followed, indicating that Iranian scientists had simply moved deeper underground, rebuilt the centrifuge cascades, and resumed enrichment operations at a faster pace.
So the strike didn't work.
The lesson from 2025 was clear. Limited kinetic strikes, no matter how heavy the ordnance, do not fundamentally erase a nation's technical knowledge or its baseline infrastructure. You can bomb the building, but you cannot bomb the physics equations out of the scientists' heads.
This brings us to the Iranian perspective, which was articulated during the recent diplomatic talks in Geneva. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi publicly dismissed President Trump's SOTU claims about ICBMs as fake news. He stated definitively, on the record, that Iran's ballistic missile program is strictly capped at a 2,000-kilometer range,
which is designed purely for regional deterrence against Israel and forward-deployed U.S. bases, not for intercontinental strikes against the American homeland.
We have to balance Araghchi's statements against other intelligence leaks, specifically regarding the maritime domain. While they may not have ICBMs reaching New York, the reporting indicates that Iran is in the final stages of a major arms deal with China to acquire CM-302 supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles.
A supersonic anti-ship missile completely alters the calculus of power projection. Those Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carriers cost roughly $13 billion each and hold over 4,000 sailors.
Right.
A CM-302 missile flies at multiple times the speed of sound, skimming just above the ocean waves to evade radar until the last possible second. It poses a lethal existential threat to those carrier groups.
And it poses an equally lethal threat to global commerce. If hostilities break out, the primary theater of engagement will inevitably be the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow maritime choke point handles 20 to 30% of the entire globe's daily crude oil supply.
If Iran utilizes those Chinese-made supersonic missiles to sink a U.S. carrier, or even just target a handful of commercial supertankers, insurance rates for shipping would instantly hit infinity. The strait would close, and the global energy market would experience an instantaneous, paralyzing shock that makes the 1970s oil crisis look like a minor inconvenience.
We are meticulously laying out the intelligence gaps between the stated timelines of the political apparatus and the classified realities on the ground. The data strongly suggests that the physical momentum toward a catastrophic regional conflict is accelerating exponentially faster than the verified threat of an ICBM reaching the United States.
While that geopolitical powder keg dominates the headlines and the Pentagon briefings, there is a horrifying, quiet crisis playing out on the ground in the Middle East that demands our focus. It was brought into the light this week by the deeply detailed first-hand testimony of a highly credible military whistleblower.
Let's examine the extensive documentation provided by retired U.S. Army Special Operations Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Aguilar. Before we get into his claims, it is vital to establish his background because it dictates the weight of his testimony.
His credentials are unquestionable.
Aguilar is not a low-level administrative contractor or a political activist. He is a West Point graduate. He holds a Bronze Star with Valor for heroism in direct combat. He's a Purple Heart recipient. He spent 2 decades managing complex military operations in the most hostile environments on Earth. He understands logistics, supply chains, and the harsh realities of war zones better than almost anyone.
That credibility is paramount. When a special operations logistics officer tells you a system is failing, you listen. When he tells you it's failing on purpose, you investigate.
In May of 2025, Aguilar deployed to Gaza under a highly specialized contract. He was working jointly with an organization called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF, and a private management company known as UG Solutions. His specific mandate was to help manage and streamline the new aid distribution mechanisms for the civilian population.
We need to look at the baseline math first.
Historically, according to UN data, sustaining the dense population in Gaza required roughly 600 trucks of humanitarian aid daily, distributed effectively across 400 different geographic sites.
Keep those baseline metrics in your head. 600 trucks. 400 distribution sites. That is the minimum required to keep the population alive.
When Aguilar arrived on the ground and reviewed the resources actually provided by the GHF, the numbers were mathematically horrifying. His team was allocated exactly 12 trucks, and they were instructed to supply a mere 3 distribution sites.
3 sites.
With those 12 trucks and 3 sites, they were expected to cover the nutritional needs of the entire population of the Strip.
It isn't a logistical shortfall, it is a mathematical impossibility. If you have 2 million people and 3 distribution sites, you are demanding that hundreds of thousands of desperate, starving people converge on a single point simultaneously. It is a recipe for a stampede before a single bullet is even fired.
But the scarcity of trucks is only a fraction of the nightmare. Aguilar testified to Congress about the physical parameters of the contract drawn up with COGAT, the Israeli Coordinating Office for Government Activities in the Territories. He discovered that the humanitarian aid contract explicitly and legally prohibited the GHF from providing water.
Let's pause and really analyze the cruelty of that specific contractual clause. An international humanitarian organization is legally barred from distributing water in a war zone where the water infrastructure has been completely decimated.
And the food they were permitted to distribute compounded that cruelty. Aguilar stated that the supplies consisted entirely of unprepared, raw, dried goods. Massive pallets of dried rice, raw flour, and uncooked pasta.
Food that fundamentally requires massive amounts of boiling water to become edible, or even safely digestible. You are handing starving people bags of raw flour while legally prohibiting them from having the water to bake it. Furthermore, Aguilar calculated that even if they managed to disperse this dried food perfectly evenly across the population, the sheer lack of volume meant it equated to just 1 single meal every 3 days per person.
Aguilar's testimony gets significantly darker when he details the geographic placement of these 3 distribution sites. They were not placed in designated safe zones or along secure border crossings. He testified that the sites were purposely positioned deep within active kinetic combat zones, specifically directly in the path of the Israeli military offensive known as Operation Gideon's Chariots.
Positioning a civilian aid station inside an advancing mechanized infantry assault is a direct violation of international law and the Geneva Conventions. It guarantees that non-combatants will be caught in the crossfire.
And Aguilar visually witnessed the inevitable tragic result of this architectural design. He detailed a specific horrific incident where one of the 3 distribution sites was entirely overrun by a desperate, panicked crowd estimated at 34,000 starving people. During the ensuing chaos, as the crowd surged toward the pallets of raw flour, Aguilar testified that he watched both IDF soldiers and heavily armed private contractors from UG Solutions open fire with automatic weapons directly into the crowds of unarmed civilians.
The operational fallout from this massacre was immediate and telling. The original director of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was a man named Jake Wood. For those who follow military contracting, Jake Wood is a known entity. He previously ran massive private military corporations like Blackwater and Triple Canopy during the height of the Iraq War. These are organizations not exactly known for their delicate human rights records.
Right.
Yet Jake Wood stepped down as the director of the GHF on the very first day of operations in Gaza. He explicitly stated on his way out that he could not, in good conscience, be part of an operation that so completely lacked basic humanitarian principles.
When a hardened mercenary CEO looks at an operation and says, "This is too far," you have crossed a very dark line. And look at who replaced him. Wood was immediately replaced by Johnny Moore. Moore has zero background in international logistics, zero background in military supply chains, and zero background in humanitarian aid.
None at all.
He is a self-proclaimed Christian Zionist and a former religious advisor to the Trump administration.
Which shifts the entire objective of the organization from humanitarian logistics to ideological messaging.
After witnessing the massacres, Aguilar resigned his contract in protest, returned to the United States, and delivered this detailed testimony directly to Congress under oath. And now, he is taking an incredibly difficult political path. He's currently running for Congress in North Carolina's District 13, challenging the incumbent Republican, Brad Knott.
And Aguilar has built his entire platform around this specific experience. He is actively refusing to accept a single dime of campaign funding from AIPAC, any foreign lobbying groups, or military-industrial complex PACs. He is attempting to build a coalition around a true, uncompromised America First foreign policy that rejects funding these types of operations abroad.
Aguilar's testimony is a massive, heavy reality that forces us to grapple with a very uncomfortable conclusion.
When you analyze the math, 12 trucks instead of 600, 3 sites instead of 400, the contractual prohibition of water, the distribution of raw flour, and the intentional placement of crowds inside a mechanized offensive, you cannot write this off as a failure of bureaucracy or logistical incompetence.
No.
It requires immense coordination to be this restrictive. Aguilar's data suggests this was a success of systemic intentional design. These are engineered outcomes, funded and facilitated by systems operating with U.S. taxpayer dollars.
That concept of systemic intentional design perfectly bridges us to the domestic investigations dominating the halls of Congress this week. We're talking about the House Oversight Committee and their incredibly high-profile, deeply contentious depositions regarding the Jeffrey Epstein network.
The Epstein network is the ghost that refuses to leave the machine. And the reason this story continues to dominate the public consciousness is that the institutional rot it exposes is so pervasive, so deep, and so completely bipartisan.
The House Oversight Committee recently issued a formal subpoena to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. In response, rather than quietly complying, she released a forceful 2-page opening statement directly onto her social media channels before the deposition even began.
Right.
In the document, she vehemently and categorically denies ever knowing Jeffrey Epstein. She explicitly states she never visited his private island in the Caribbean, never flew on his private plane, the Lolita Express, and had absolutely zero knowledge of any of the sprawling criminal and trafficking activities conducted by him or Ghislaine Maxwell.
From a strict legal standpoint, her statement is incredibly forceful and leaves very little room for ambiguity. But from a public relations and political optics standpoint, analysts immediately pointed to the massive volume of photographic and documentary evidence regarding her husband, former President Bill Clinton, and their broader elite social circle.
Yes, and former President Bill Clinton is legally scheduled to be deposed by the committee next.
Right. You have to look at the visual evidence that is circulating in these reports. Specifically, there is the infamous photograph featuring Jeffrey Epstein sitting comfortably on a purple couch alongside former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and high-profile legal scholar Alan Dershowitz.
The optics are terrible.
The visual evidence of Epstein's deep casual integration into the absolute highest echelons of global academic, financial, and political power makes blanket denials of association politically difficult to sustain. The public looks at those photos and realizes that Epstein wasn't a fringe character, he was standing in the center of the room.
But while the House Oversight Committee is aggressively utilizing its subpoena power to pursue the Clintons and their network, there is a massive highly concerned of structural irregularity happening quietly in the background at the Department of Justice.
This is where it gets really complicated.
According to extensive reporting published by the Wall Street Journal and corroborated by legal analyst Lisa Rubin, the DOJ is currently reviewing a cache of missing Epstein files.
Let's emphasize that phrase. Missing files from one of the most heavily scrutinized, high-profile federal sex trafficking investigations in American history. Files do not simply vanish from a secure DOJ server by accident.
The reporting states that Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche has explicitly directed staffers to flag and locate exactly 53 missing pages of interview transcripts. These aren't random administrative notes. These 53 pages contain detailed interviews with a specific woman who formerly accused Donald Trump of sexually assaulting her in 1983 when she was reportedly just 13 or 14 years old and Trump was in his late 30s.
The juxtaposition of these two events creates an intense, fiery debate regarding the nature of political theater versus the genuine pursuit of justice. You have a Republican-led congressional committee aggressively targeting Democratic figures with subpoenas, while simultaneously the Department of Justice is scrambling to locate 53 highly damning pages regarding the sitting Republican president that have simply evaporated from the archives.
It forces us to ask, is this congressional investigation a genuine good faith search for the truth, or is it merely the weaponization of subpoena power to damage political opponents while deliberately ignoring the glaring omissions within their own camp?
I would argue that both things can be true simultaneously. The partisan motivations driving the House Oversight Committee are glaringly obvious. However, regardless of the political weaponry being wielded, the exposure of the Epstein network's deep systemic ties to global elites is a necessary historical reckoning. The fact that former U.S. presidents, Treasury secretaries, and global financiers are being forced, under the threat of perjury, to answer questions about their proximity to an international trafficking ring is a massive anomaly. The system is cannibalizing itself, and while the motives are impure, the transparency generated is vital.
We are tracking the legal and congressional maneuvers of both Democratic and Republican figures based strictly on the reported documentation. We're analyzing the selective application of investigative power and the deeply troubling reality that 53 pages of federal investigation can simply disappear.
It perfectly illustrates the macro theme of today's broadcast, the absolute fragility and potential corruption of the massive systems we blindly trust to maintain order. And tragically, that systemic failure isn't just happening in the abstract halls of Congress or in classified Pentagon briefing rooms. It is happening with lethal consequences on the frozen streets of our own cities.
Which brings us to the deeply tragic, infuriating report compiled by Katie Fang regarding a man named Nuru Amin Shah Alam. We are going to meticulously reconstruct the timeline of this man's final year because the complete top-to-bottom breakdown of basic human empathy across multiple agencies is astounding. Nuru was a 56-year-old Rohingya refugee.
The Rohingya have been subjected to an internationally recognized brutal ethnic cleansing and genocide in Myanmar.
Exactly. He fled that genocide seeking legal sanctuary. He arrived in the United States utilizing the formal asylum process in December of 2024, accompanied by his wife and 2 sons. Furthermore, Nuru was severely visually impaired. He was nearly blind.
He followed the rules. He sought asylum from a war zone.
In February of 2025, just months after arriving, Nuru was arrested by local police in Buffalo, New York. The inciting incident that led to his arrest is heartbreaking in its mundanity. Because of his severe visual impairment, he became disoriented and wandered into a stranger's residential yard. The police were called. He was arrested and charged with trespassing and possessing a weapon.
We need to define what the police classified as a weapon in this context.
The weapons were actually a pair of standard window curtain rods that Nuru had physically fashioned into walking sticks to help him navigate the sidewalks because he could not see. The police body cam footage of the arrest was released. It shows this 56-year-old blind man holding the curtain rods. He speaks absolutely no English, so he cannot understand the officer's shouted commands to drop the weapons.
It's awful.
The footage captures him pleading for God's help in his native Rohingya language, visibly terrified, right before the officers tackle him to the ground and deploy a taser on him.
Because the police chose to charge him with a felony for the curtain rods, it triggered an automatic, catastrophic chain reaction within the legal system. The local authorities immediately placed a federal immigration detainer on him. His family was terrified. They knew that if they paid his bail and triggered his release, the detainer meant he would be immediately transferred to ICE custody and potentially deported directly back to the active genocide in Myanmar.
So they were trapped.
Yes. So to keep him in the country, they made the agonizing decision to leave him sitting in a local county jail cell for an entire year while his overburdened public defenders slowly negotiated with the district attorney.
Finally, after a year behind bars, the DA's office recognized the absurdity of prosecuting a blind refugee for carrying curtain rods. They agreed to let him plead down to simple misdemeanors, which meant he would avoid mandatory deportation. His family was ecstatic. His bond was officially posted on the morning of February 19, 2026. His wife and sons, along with his legal team, were physically waiting in the lobby of the jail, holding his winter clothes, ready to take him home.
This is the exact moment where the catastrophic, lethal federal failure occurs.
Upon his release from the local holding cell, Customs and Border Protection CBP stepped in and took physical custody of him to process the lingering immigration detainer. They placed him in a holding room, ran his biometrics through their federal databases, and quickly determined what his lawyers had known all along. Nuru was, in fact, completely non-deportable due to his legitimate, active, and legally recognized asylum status.
So CBP possesses a 56-year-old nearly blind man who speaks no English. They have legally determined they cannot deport him. They are standing in a facility where they know his family and lawyers are actively waiting to receive him. What is the standard operating procedure here?
The standard procedure and basic human decency would be to walk him out to the lobby. Instead, CBP agents inexplicably placed Nuru into a white transport van.
The surveillance data and timelines acquired by reporters paint a vivid, horrifying picture of what happened next. At 8 p.m., after the sun had set, in below freezing temperatures and active heavy snowfall, the CBP agents drove the van to a commercial shopping plaza miles north of downtown Buffalo. They pulled up to a Tim Hortons coffee shop and ordered him out of the vehicle.
The Tim Hortons had already been closed and locked for over an hour. The security footage shows Nuru stepping out of the van into the snow. He was left wearing only the thin, uninsulated clothes he was arrested in an entire year prior. He did not even have shoes. CBP dropped him into a blizzard wearing only the thin, orange paper prisoner booties issued by the jail shower facility. The footage shows the CBP van simply reversing and driving away, abandoning a blind, non-English-speaking man in a freezing, empty parking lot.
The conclusion to this timeline is as grim as it is inevitable. 5 days after that van drove away, Nuru's frozen body was discovered by a passerby in a snowbank 5 miles away from the coffee shop. He had spent his final days wandering blindly through a freezing, unfamiliar city, slowly succumbing to the elements.
And the systemic failure didn't even end with his death. It immediately morphed into a bureaucratic cover-up. Upon discovering the body, local police spokespeople immediately issued statements to the press attempting to classify his passing as a health-related medical incident, proactively trying to rule out environmental exposure in order to shield the local and federal agencies from liability.
But the medical science refused to comply with the PR strategy. The Erie County Medical Examiner was forced to issue a highly unusual public statement disputing the police account, clarifying explicitly that no cause of death had been determined and that severe hypothermia was the primary focus of the autopsy.
When you step back and look at the totality of Nuru's story, what does it reveal about the underlying machinery of our institutions?
It reveals a complete top-to-bottom evaporation of basic human empathy, replaced entirely by rigid, unthinking bureaucratic process. The local law enforcement officers failed their most basic mandate to de-escalate a situation with a disabled, confused individual. The district attorney's office allowed a blind man to sit in a concrete cell for 365 days over walking sticks.
And the federal immigration authorities, upon realizing he was no longer their legal problem, simply discarded him in a snowstorm like refuse, completely bypassing his waiting family because processing him out properly would have required an extra hour of paperwork.
It is a profound, terrifying indictment of the administrative state. The system didn't just fail Nuru, it actively processed him to death.
It is incredibly infuriating.
Yeah.
And it stands in such stark, bizarre contrast to the reality playing out at the absolute highest echelons of government, where political theater, aesthetics, and optics completely override the actual business of governance. Let's look at a highly surreal domestic news item from this week that perfectly crystallizes this contrast.
The juxtaposition is almost dizzying.
Recently, Mayor Zohran Mamdani traveled to Washington for a formal meeting with President Trump at the White House. The context overshadowing this high-level meeting was a widely publicized, chaotic incident that occurred in New York City a few days prior. A massive group of grown men engaged in an aggressive, escalating snowball fight in the streets, which culminated in them pelting responding NYPD officers with snowballs that had been dangerously loaded with solid ice and rocks.
It was a highly viral incident that dominated the local news cycles, tapping into broader anxieties about urban disorder and respect for law enforcement.
Following his meeting with the mayor, President Trump walked out to the press pool and issued a direct, public statement addressing the police officers involved in the incident. He looked at the cameras and said, if you're going to throw a snowball at anybody, throw it at me.
We need to unpack the architecture of that statement because from a media manipulation and optics perspective, it is a masterclass in psychological tactics.
Break that down.
On the absolute surface level, if you were just reading the transcript, it sounds like a noble, protective defense of the beleaguered police officers. He is stepping in front of the attack. But functionally, subconsciously, it operates as a highly subtle, incredibly effective mechanism of asserting dominance.
How does offering to take a snowball assert dominance over the police?
By telling the public to throw the snowballs at him instead of the NYPD, Trump is simultaneously achieving two opposing psychological goals. First, he is quietly emasculating the police force. He is implying that fully armored, trained NYPD officers are too soft, too fragile, or too incompetent to handle a street-level snowball fight, and therefore require the president to step in and save them. Second, he is elevating himself. He is positioning himself as the ultimate, untouchable, hypermasculine authority figure who can effortlessly absorb the attack that sent the police running. He isn't offering a policy solution to urban crime. He is offering an aesthetic of absolute dominance. It is a micro case study in how modern political figures use the media narrative to project power while actively diminishing the institutions beneath them.
Whether we are looking at a corporate boardroom, executing a mass layoff of 4,400 people via automated systems, an intelligence apparatus deeply divided over the timeline of ballistic missiles while positioning aircraft carriers, or a border patrol unit abandoning a vulnerable blind refugee in the freezing cold, the singular thread connecting today's news is undeniable.
The singular takeaway you need to remember for the rest of the week is the absolute terrifying fragility of the systems we trust to sustain our society. The era of assuming that our institutions, whether they be military, corporate, or local bureaucracy, are acting competently, ethically, or even rationally is completely over. Survival in this current paradigm now requires demanding hard data, questioning every official narrative, and recognizing that the guardrails we thought were protecting us have already been removed.
As you digest everything we've unpacked today, I want you to consider something. As we watch multi-billion-dollar industries and decades of geopolitical strategy get upended seemingly overnight, we have to ask ourselves, are the massive systems we rely on failing us by tragic accident, or are they functioning exactly as they've been quietly redesigned to? Look closely at the data this week and decide for yourself. If you found this analysis valuable, hit the plus or follow button on your podcast app and give us a like. Subscribe to the Hot News channel for more deep dives. Until we meet again, goodbye.